The camera lights blazed down on Karoline Leavitt as she took her seat in the middle of the studio, her expression cool and composed. The host, David Carter, a well-known liberal pundit with a reputation for pushing aggressive narratives, flashed a smile. The atmosphere in the room felt electric, charged with the anticipation of another heated political debate. This was her first time on his show, and she knew exactly what was at stake. Karoline had been in the political arena long enough to know how these things went. She had dealt with the left-wing media's attacks before, the biased questions, the cherry-picked facts, and the sneering commentary. But today felt different. She had prepared herself for the worst, and she wasn't going to let David Carter, or anyone else, distort the truth. Carter's voice rang out as the segment began. Welcome back, folks. Tonight's guest is Karoline Leavitt, a rising star in the Republican Party and former press secretary for President Trump. Karoline, thanks for being here. Karoline nodded, giving a polite smile. Thanks for having me, David. David leaned in, his tone shifting. Now, Karoline, we all know that you've been a staunch defender of the previous administration's policies. But there's one issue that's been particularly divisive, the economy under Trump. Let's talk about it. During the pandemic, we saw millions lose their jobs, record unemployment numbers, and a disastrous economic collapse. How do you justify defending a president whose economic legacy was so deeply affected by the pandemic? Karoline's heart rate stayed steady. She had expected this question. Of course, Carter was going to play the classic left-wing card, attack Trump on the economy and blame him for everything that went wrong. But Karoline had a different approach in mind. She leaned forward slightly, letting the moment breathe before responding. David, I appreciate your question, Karoline began, her voice calm yet firm. But I think you're ignoring one crucial fact that the media often overlooks. The pandemic wasn't just an economic downturn, it was an unprecedented global crisis. President Trump's policies, particularly the CARES Act, provided immediate relief to millions of Americans. But what really matters is that under Trump's leadership, the economy rebounded faster than expected. David's eyebrows shot up. He hadn't expected that response. But Karoline, those relief packages didn't save everyone, he pressed. And what about the long-term damage? The national debt skyrocketed during the Trump administration. Karoline took a deep breath, her mind racing through the facts she'd been gathering for weeks. This was the kind of misinformation the liberal media loved to spread, blaming Trump for the debt without acknowledging the bipartisan effort behind the pandemic relief bills. David, let's be clear about something, Karoline said, her voice sharp but controlled. The national debt you're referring to wasn't caused by Trump's policies alone. The pandemic forced the government to spend trillions to keep people afloat. But let's not forget that under President Trump, we also saw the fastest wage growth for working-class Americans in decades, and unemployment rates for African Americans, Hispanics, and women reached record lows before the pandemic hit. The room fell silent. David Carter's smile faltered for just a moment, and the audience could feel the shift in the air. Karoline wasn't following the typical script. She wasn't playing the victim, she was delivering facts, not rhetoric. David recovered quickly, trying to steer the conversation back. But those are pre-pandemic numbers, Karoline. We're talking about real-time results. After the pandemic, millions lost their jobs, and the recovery has been slow. Under Joe Biden, we've seen the economy gain back some of those jobs. So tell me, why does Trump still get credit for that? Karoline's eyes flickered, but her smile never wavered. David, Let's talk about something that has been conveniently ignored, she said, her voice ringing with confidence. Under Trump, the tax cuts for businesses and individuals created a booming economy that was able to recover faster than many of the experts predicted. And let's not forget, Biden didn't inherit a broken economy. The groundwork for recovery was laid under the previous administration. But you're right about one thing. Joe Biden's policies, particularly the spending bills, have delayed a full recovery. David's face was starting to show signs of irritation, but Karoline wasn't finished. She could feel the momentum building. The real problem is not just the debt or the pandemic, she continued. It's that the liberal media has become so fixated on shaming Trump that it's turned a blind eye to the economic miracle we saw before the pandemic. The tax cuts, deregulation, energy independence, these were all Trump policies that put America on the path to success. And now we're seeing the same policies being reversed, and Americans are feeling the pain at the gas pump and grocery store. David opened his mouth to interject, but Karoline didn't give him the chance. You know, David, she said, turning to face him directly, you keep talking about the debt and unemployment, but let's address the reality. The inflation we're seeing today, the rising costs of living, and the failing supply chains are the direct result of the policies being pushed by the Biden administration. The tension in the room was palpable. The audience had been listening intently, and Karoline could feel the shift in their energy. She had stopped trying to play the game of back and forth and instead had focused on one thing: facts. And she knew that, for all the media noise, facts were still the most powerful weapon in any political debate. Karoline looked out at the crowd, the room now buzzing with quiet energy. The truth is, David, you can't ignore reality. People are hurting, and while you continue to push a narrative, it's those real-world consequences that are being felt by working Americans every day. The audience, until that moment silent and tense, suddenly erupted in spontaneous applause. David Carter's expression froze. He had been completely unprepared for this. The crowd had always been in his favor, and yet here they were, responding to Karoline's words with approval. David's face flushed with discomfort. All right, he said, waving his hand, clearly trying to regain control of the segment. I see you've made your point. But Karoline wasn't finished. I'm not here to play politics, David. I'm here to speak the truth, she said, her voice firm. The people deserve a president who puts America first, and that's exactly what Donald Trump did. And that's why his policies will continue to inspire the future of this country. As the applause continued, David Carter had no choice but to shift the conversation, his face betraying the irritation he was trying to suppress. Karoline had done what few could. She had taken control of the conversation, stunned the host, and left an undeniable impact on the audience. And in that moment, Karoline Leavitt had proven, once again, that her strength wasn't just in her words, it was in her unwavering belief in the truth. As the segment wrapped up, Karoline Leavitt stood in front of the studio, her mind racing. The applause still rang in her ears, but she knew the battle wasn't over. David Carter had tried to regain control, but the truth had already landed. She felt the familiar weight of media scrutiny bearing down on her as she prepared to leave the studio. The moment the show ended, Karoline was greeted by her team, their faces a mix of pride and admiration. But as they moved toward the exit, the news outlets were already spinning the narrative. Karoline Leavitt stuns David Carter with unexpected response on economy, read the headline on one news website. Another outlet called it a masterclass in political strategy. Karoline's words had caught fire, and she knew she was about to face the consequences. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications from reporters, journalists, and political pundits. Some were complimentary, others were ready to tear her down. The most surprising thing was the sheer amount of coverage this debate had garnered. As she settled into the back seat of the car that would take her to her next appointment, she reflected on the interview. She had known the left-wing media would attack her. They had been doing it for years. But today felt different. Her facts had struck a chord, and there was a growing sense of momentum that she hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just a press secretary anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with. Within hours, the attacks began, sharp, cutting, and calculated. David Carter took to his social media, posting a series of rebuttals in which he tried to dismiss her comments. But the backlash against him was louder than he anticipated. Karoline Leavitt doesn't just defend Trump's policies, she defends them without understanding the damage they've caused, he tweeted. But the response was immediate. People flooded his comments, pointing out the gaps in his argument, highlighting Karoline's detailed rebuttal of the economic narrative. "You can't ignore facts, David," one user commented, and it was clear, this wasn't going to be a victory for Carter. The next day, Karoline's appearance on the show had become a political talking point across the spectrum. Even moderate commentators, who often found themselves caught in the middle of political divides, began to ask the tough questions. Were inflation and gas prices really a result of Trump's policies, or was it the post-pandemic government spending that was to blame? But what really caught her attention was the growing sentiment in the comment sections of news articles, interviews, and social media platforms. People weren't just supporting her, they were engaging in a larger conversation about the economic future of America. As the next day's news cycle continued, Karoline found herself at the center of a storm. More interviews were scheduled, and for the first time, she was being seen not just as a spokesperson, but as a leader who could stand up and fight back against the media's narrative. By the third day after her interview, the polling numbers started to reflect the shift in the public's perception. Karoline's approval ratings surged, especially among independent voters who were tired of the media spin on both sides. News outlets were divided. Conservative stations were calling her a truth-teller and a rising star who wasn't afraid to challenge the media narrative. Liberal outlets, on the other hand, began to dig deeper into the specifics of the CARES Act, unemployment rates, and the economic relief under Trump's presidency. But no matter how they tried to twist it, Karoline's words had struck a chord. She wasn't just defending Trump's record, she was presenting a counter-narrative that the left was struggling to suppress. At the same time, Karoline's message of economic independence and empowerment began to resonate beyond the political spectrum. She wasn't just talking about Republican policies. She was talking about the future of America's economic prosperity, about working-class Americans who had been hit hardest by the pandemic but were still hopeful for a better tomorrow. Her words weren't just political talking points. They were a call to action. A way to rethink how policies could be made to serve the people, not the elites. And that, more than anything, was what made her stand out. The day after the interview aired, Karoline was invited to a nationally televised debate where she would face off with leading Democratic economists and political analysts. It was the perfect stage for her to solidify her position as a credible voice in American politics. The debate started with questions about the economy, inflation, rising costs, and the bipartisan spending bills that had been passed after the pandemic. It quickly became clear that the moderators were hoping to paint her into a corner, trying to trap her with contradictions in her defense of Trump's economic record. But Karoline was ready. When the first economist launched into a lengthy argument about the damage done by Trump's tax cuts and how they disproportionately benefited the wealthy, Karoline responded without hesitation. "We can talk about the wealthy all day," she began, her voice steady but strong. But what really matters is the fact that tax cuts for businesses created jobs for working-class Americans. And while we're on the topic of jobs, let's not forget that under President Trump, unemployment rates for African Americans, Hispanics, and women reached historic lows before the pandemic hit. The Economist stammered, trying to counter her points, but Karoline continued to hammer home her message, shifting the focus from the talking points to the real results of Trump's policies. The problem isn't tax cuts or regulation. The problem is that under this administration, we're seeing job opportunities decrease and costs skyrocket for middle-class families. The room went quiet. The moderators were forced to move on to another question, and for the first time in a while, Karoline had successfully controlled the conversation. By the end of the week, Karoline's debate performance had been dissected in countless political talk shows and news segments. But what stood out wasn't just her ability to stand her ground, it was her ability to shift the conversation. She had successfully shown that the real issue wasn't just partisan politics, but the real-life effects of government policies on the people. Inflation and job loss were no longer just issues debated in the halls of Congress. They were everyday struggles for American families. In the days that followed, Karoline's popularity continued to grow. Supporters rallied behind her, not just Republicans, but independents, moderates, and even disillusioned Democrats who were tired of media manipulation. And the best part? Karoline didn't need to win every argument or convince every person in the room. She had simply told the truth, and in doing so, she had ignited a larger movement, one that was focused on the future of America and the real issues that affected its people. Her words had shifted the debate in the right direction. And as she moved forward in her political career, one thing was clear: Karoline Leavitt was a force to be reckoned with. By the time the final debate aired, Karoline Leavitt had become a household name in American politics. Her powerful performances, especially her direct engagement with the liberal media, had earned her admiration from across the political spectrum. But with every victory, the pressure only mounted. It had been several weeks since her appearance on David Carter's show, and Karoline knew that the fight wasn't over. The left-wing media wasn't about to let go of the narrative she had dismantled so easily. They would come after her with everything they had, trying to weaken her credibility and undermine the groundswell of support she had built. But Karoline had faced much worse. She had risen through the ranks of a hostile political landscape, a young woman with a sharp mind and a voice that carried far beyond her age. She had learned early on that the media would twist facts, that opponents would resort to personal attacks, and that the battle for truth was never a quick or easy one. What had begun as a single debate over the economy had transformed into a full-scale political battle. Karoline had shown the world that she was not just a spokesperson for the Republican Party. She was a champion for real change. Her ability to cut through the noise had made her a formidable presence in the fight for America's future. But now, as she prepared for the next major national address, Karoline was focused not on the headlines or the commentary, but on the real-world issues she was determined to solve. The night before her highly anticipated national address, Karoline sat alone in her office. The city lights outside the window glimmered, casting a soft glow across her desk. She took a moment to reflect on how far she had come, from an intern answering calls to becoming one of the most recognized political figures in the country. The upcoming address was more than just another speech. It was her moment to lay out her vision for the future, a future focused on the American people, on creating opportunities, not just for the wealthy but for every citizen, regardless of political affiliation. She thought about the discussions with everyday people she had had over the past few weeks, their concerns about inflation, rising gas prices, and the state of the economy. She remembered the disillusioned faces of voters who had once been promised change but had only been met with empty promises. This speech was for them. This time, it was personal. Karoline didn't just want to be a voice for the right. She wanted to be a voice for all Americans, those who were working hard every day to make ends meet, those who were struggling to provide for their families, and those who were worried about their futures in an economy that seemed to leave them behind. As she sat at her desk, her hands resting on the printed pages of the speech, Karoline's mind drifted back to David Carter's studio, where she had stunned him and the audience with her directness. She had made her mark that day, but now she was ready to push even further. She would define the next chapter of American politics. The clock ticked. The speech was ready. Karoline stood up, taking a deep breath as she made her way to the door. This wasn't just about politics. It was about creating a legacy of truth and change. The address began just like any other national speech, a packed auditorium with live cameras, an audience full of politicians and journalists. But Karoline was no ordinary speaker, and this was no ordinary speech. As she stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. Karoline's confidence radiated, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. She began, not with a political jibe or an attack on the other side, but with a powerful statement that resonated across the nation. We live in a nation full of promise, but also full of challenges. And those challenges are not only financial. They are about who we are, who we will become, and whether or not we will make the right decisions for the future of our children. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. Her eyes scanned the room, then turned to the cameras. For too long, we have let ourselves be divided by narratives and ideologies that distract us from the real issues. We have focused too much on what divides us and too little on what unites us. And now, in the face of a global economic downturn, rising inflation, and a struggling middle class, we have to make a choice. We have to choose to rebuild the American dream, a dream that works for everyone, not just the elites. Her words cut through the noise, and for the first time in what felt like a long time, the room was silent, hanging on to every syllable. Karoline continued, laying out her vision for economic recovery. Lower taxes for small businesses, a focus on sustainable jobs, and an emphasis on education to give young Americans the skills to thrive in a changing world. She spoke not only to the politicians in the room, but to every American watching at home. Her voice echoed with authenticity, and her words carried the weight of someone who had lived through the struggles she described. This wasn't just political rhetoric, it was a call to action. As the speech came to an end, Karoline stood tall, her final words hanging in the air. America doesn't need division. It needs unity. It needs the strength to look forward, to face our challenges head-on, and to build a future where the American dream is alive and well, for every American. The crowd erupted into applause, and Karoline knew this moment would be remembered. The days following the address saw Karoline Leavitt's popularity soar. Her approval ratings from independent voters climbed dramatically. She had laid out her vision, and America had listened. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just another politician. She was a leader who had shown that the path to recovery didn't rely on political ideologies. It relied on the American people. Karoline's message continued to resonate. The right-wing media hailed her as a champion for the working class, while the left-wing media couldn't ignore the fact that she had captured the hearts of people from all political backgrounds. It was a moment of unity in a time when division had become the norm. David Carter, the liberal host who had tried to undermine her in the past, was forced to acknowledge the shift. He tweeted, "Karoline Leavitt has tapped into something real. Whether you agree with her or not, she's changed the conversation. And that's something we all need to think about." The impact of her bold response, both on air and through the national address, was undeniable. Karoline had stunned her critics, silenced her opponents, and left a lasting mark on the political landscape. Her journey had just begun, but it was clear to everyone watching that Karoline Leavitt was no longer just a rising star. She was a force to be reckoned with.